I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. Today's guest is Damien Patrick Williams, a PhD researcher at Virginia Tech in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society. His research areas include ethics, epistemology, philosophy of technology, philosophy of mind, nonhuman intelligence, machine consciousness, comparative religious traditions, human biotechnological interventions, and the occult. He writes at afutureworththinkingabout.com.
I've just been personally recently thinking about the position of technology and the position of the resonance with technology in the occult. I was awake several times last night thinking about the current that's going on with like people, the way they think about their algorithms and the way they think about the tools and tech that they're using. And I just kept getting struck by this theme that's been played out in a couple of other people's works, but it's like this notion of like animism, like old school animism and totemism, and the way that we think about like the Internet of Things or the algorithmic entities that exist in the Internet, and like the ways that we've kind of allowed that to seep back in to the world that we live in kind of through the back door. Without really examining why or what we're doing with it. And I've been trying to figure out, like, I know that there's something that I want to work on specifically in that field. Like, I work in that conjunction pretty much just across the board. That's where the majority of my research sits. But I've been wanting to try to figure out a way to talk about it in more of a prescriptive rather than a descriptive sense. Like most of the work that I do is about just describing those conceptual overlaps and the linkages between them. But I feel like we're in a place and at a time where we kind of need to be thinking about ways to say, okay, so what do we do with that more and more intensely, more intentionally? Because, well, things are kind of chaotic and drastic in a way that they, I'm sure, have been in the past, but with a kind of level of power and urgency concentrated in like very small pockets that we haven't seen before, you know?
And global, like completely right. Global now.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And it's like everyone everywhere has easy access to the ability to disrupt the reality of everyone everywhere. Like that's different. Like it used to be the case that we would have, you know, locally the ability to kind of test and maneuver and nudge each other's realities, you know, within our communities, within the, you know, the city we live in or the state that we live in, and like a few people had the power to do that kind of action on a global scale. But it has increasingly become the case that we all have the power, for better or worse, to do that kind of thing on a global scale in ways that can be massively disruptive or massively dangerous or massively beneficial, depending upon how they're used. And so I'm trying to think about ways that we can do those things, engage those technologies, those conjunctions of concepts of, you know, how we think about the manipulation of perception via language and symbols and art and music, sound, embodiment, and how we think about how that influences our technologies and how it makes the things that we make and put out into the world that can have those kinds of effects differently depending upon how we approach it.
And how did you get involved on this kind of career path in the first place?
It's literally just the kind of stuff I've been thinking about since I was very, very young. Like, to the point where, every so often I will encounter a piece of writing or a conjunction of, theories, and I will think back to the kind of very half-formed, very nascent version of that I had when I was a kid, and it's like, we all have these kind of fantastical career paths laid out for us. When I was a kid, I wanted to be all kinds of things that were probably not super feasible, but there were certain things I wanted to do. Like, I always knew I wanted to do stuff with, like, technology and magic and, the kind of weird science aspects of things. And I managed to kind of semi-intentionally, but kind of accidentally and luckily, being very fortunate to encounter a bunch of different people along the way, make my way into a life where I could do that. I started in wanting, like, when I was a teenager, wanting to do art for a living, like visual art. And then I moved away from that and started thinking more about philosophy and writing and wanting to do that for a living. And then I moved in through that into seeing the kinds of things that were available in religious studies, and seeing that if I put, creative impulses to philosophy and to religious studies, then that was a fairly large chunk of things that I had always been drawn towards anyway. Mm-hmm. So putting those things in conversation with each other and trying to make my path through college and graduate school with that. And then as I continued down that path, I saw that the things that I wanted to be talking about, I could link those things up with how I wanted to talk about technology, and how specifically talking about things like, machine intelligence or machine consciousness, and, human biotechnological interventions and prosthetics and cybernetics and cyborging and all that kind of thing. And that there was a way for me to talk about, the intentionality of philosophical engagement, religious studies, and the occult, with cybernetics, with so-called artificial intelligence, and to build those things into a way of thinking about and understanding all of those things together. And I just kind of kept doing that, kept writing that, and kept talking about that. And I eventually found that there were other people who, were thinking that way. Like, when I was in college, I met a bunch of people who were thinking that way and working that way. And when I got out of college and was doing that work for a job, when I was teaching as part of my career, I found that there were people who were thinking and working in that way as well, and that they were in other programs around the world and around the country, and we just kind of slowly accreted to each other, and all kind of built a network of ways to work and ways to think, and tried to learn as much from those people as I could, and tried to build up the parts that I didn't have a really good grasp on, and tried to make myself available to be that for anybody else if I could. And just kept trying to do it until it happened.
And it's happening.
Yeah, it is. Sometimes it is happening a bit much.
Yeah, you seem to have a really busy summer and fall.
Yes, like the Horsey books tweet. Everything happened so much. Yeah, like, that was pretty much the entirety of 2017 and 2018. Like, it was just really, really intense. But it's to the point where it's like, I know that this is the work that I want to be doing, that there's a value in doing this work and helping get this work out to a wider audience, a wider experience base for people who haven't thought this way before, or who are maybe starting to try to want to think this way, but don't have, the background tools to, do so, to be able to help nudge and say, well, here are some background tools that maybe you could try to start with and see where they take you. And it takes a lot, like doing a PhD 10 years after having finished my first graduate degree it's a shift. But it's in a place and with a group of people, like the community that I'm working with is a fantastic group of people. And they, were not the kind of people that I had to convince of the value of this project. They were more of the kind who said, this project seems fully formed in your mind. What do you think we can do for that? Like, that's a way of framing that question that hadn't been asked to me before. Mm-hmm. like what do you think we can do to actually forward this project in any way that you are not already doing? Was not something that anybody had asked me. So
no, it's fantastic.
Yeah. And so it is sometimes stressful and it is sometimes a little overwhelming, but it is also exactly what I want to be doing and exactly what I've wanted to be doing for a very long time. And if I didn't do it, I don't think I would be able to really look at myself and say, what else would I be doing if not this? I was teaching and I loved teaching, but there was only so far that, and the people I worked with while I was teaching the university I worked at and my department heads said to me, there's only so far we're going to be able to go with you if you don't have this further, PhD kind of credential. And that's just the nature of the academic system in the United States at present, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And, that was a thing that we understood. And when I got the opportunity to do this PhD, they were ecstatic for me to do so. So I love teaching and I miss it, but at the same time, if I want to be able to do it as well as I can, I have to do this.
And what's your PhD in exactly?
So the exact program is it's STS, which is variously played out as either science and technology studies or science, technology, and society, depending on the program exactly, like wherever you are. But usually when you say STS to the STS community, regardless of how they play the acronym out, they know, where you are and what you're about. So, yeah, the science, technology, and society is like one of those heavily interdisciplinary programs, which is one of the things that drew me to it. And once I learned more about it, like everybody I knew who I met when I was learning about STS was like, how are you not already here? I met, back in 2016, I met some just really, really great STS instructors and people who had been working in the field for ages, and their work is just prominent, and they were like, so you need to be doing STS. And then later that year I met some more people who were working in the program that I'm currently in, who felt very much the same way and who kind of heavily nudged me towards making sure that I was in an STS program. It comes from a background of sociology, history, philosophy of technology. You get a lot of women and gender studies. You get a lot of political science. You get a lot of history of policy, science policy work, history of science specifically. This note, like one of the three themes that runs through it is this social construction of technology and how that has been shaped by the communities of scientists that have been built up over the years, and how those communities have specific values and specific perspectives, that have led them towards investigating the things that they investigate and thinking the ways that they think and doing the work that they do in the way that they do it, and how all of that has a kind of direct impact on what we think of as science and what we think of as technology, and what gets accepted as, really real, quote unquote, real science and real technology, and how there are, again, there are values that get embedded in science. There's values that get embedded in technology, and how that can have lasting, drastic, long-term effects that are often uninvestigated. So, looking at the work that I was doing, the work that I have been doing, looking at how values get embedded into artificial intelligence, how values get embedded into, cybernetics and human biotech, and values getting embedded into other technological systems, and how the intentional engagement of our morals, our theories of knowledge can bring us towards different ways of understanding the world, and how those will yield different systems that are not necessarily, at odds with one another. Like, they're not necessarily to say that one must be right or one must be wrong. They're just different because they are built on different preconditions, different values, different beliefs, and how they will each possibly have an internal consistency. So I was doing all of that already, and then someone said, here's STS, which is a place that has all of those things being done. Why don't you come get a PhD with us and do this, more so, with even more institutional support and funding for your program.
And in what ways are you and your colleagues, other people's in your field, trying to shift those dynamics?
It's actually kind of an ongoing debate within STS, honestly. There are a lot of people within STS and the Academy who are trying to figure out what our responsibility is. So one of the most well-known people in STS is a guy named Bruno Latour. And he recently put out there's a big profile on him, because Bruno Latour was one of the people who was instrumental in kind of bringing to the fore this notion of, questioning the underpinnings of science and social construction of science, and saying, maybe this stuff that is being done isn't about objective truth in the way that people think it is in science. And that's not to say that there is nothing truthful here. It's to say that maybe we don't get at objective truth. And this led to, unfortunately, being taken up by a lot of people who went on to then use it to deny climate change and vaccines, and to say that, if these people who study science for a living, who study the history and the sociology of science, say that maybe there's no objective truth, and who are you to say that my position is wrong? And that's not what was necessarily intended. It was more to say that it was, the way that we have gotten to accept the science we accept has been conditioned on certain historical factors. So what if we try conditioning it on different historical factors? What if we try building a different kind of program? Not to say just tear it all down and start from zero, but to say, what would it look like if we ran up a different program of science from different historical preconditions? And, this led to what were, for a while known as the science wars. And this led to this notion of, there's no real ideas that can be said to be true, and there's no place for critique within the notion of science and science history. And there's a lot of back and forth about all of this. And Latour recently has kind of tried to come back and say, look, what I said I don't regret it, but it's been massively misunderstood and misinterpreted for the past 20 years. And that's done massive damage. And so he's tried to go about setting the record straight in all of that. And there are people who are in the same vein of trying to say that we need to be proactive and we need to try to, make a program of, like a program of prescription to say this is how we should go about doing science, building technology, and thinking about making policy about engaging with science and technology in the world. But there are also those who are like, is that our job? Isn't it our job to say, this is what is being done? Here it is clearly laid out. Here it is clearly seen, demonstrated that this is how your scientific program, your society, your community of science and technology gets built. And here's how that process of being built, of being constructed, plays into the kind of work that you do that you consider to be valid. And here's what that does to the rest of the world when your project is taken up and is shown a light on and said, this is science, this is technology. Some people in STS are like, isn't it enough that we do that we demonstrate that? Who are we to then say, so don't do that, do this instead? Because if we say do this instead, aren't we just going to be saying, our way is better than your way for these reasons, but isn't our way also a construction? Isn't our way also built on historical precedents and antecedents and sociological factors of power and the political environment in which it all came to be? It's not to say necessarily that maybe we shouldn't say that ours is better. Maybe we should say that it's different. Here's another way of thinking about it. And so that's what some other people are trying to do. And some other people are trying not to do really either of those things and just want to describe and want to kind of say, I have described it for you. And that's all that I need to do. That's where my responsibility ends. I have described it clearly. The end. I tend to find myself more weaving between all of those things and saying, I don't think that there's any one right way. I think that there are definite problems with the ways that things have been done, with the ways that science and technology have been constructed so far. And, I think that we push back on that by highlighting what those problems are, by showing how they've come to be, by saying, hey, look at the history of eugenics, look at the history of, scientific racism, look at the history of how certain people were forcibly institutionalized and sterilized against their will because science at the time said that that was the thing that we should do. The construction of the best science that we had available to us at that time said that these were okay things that should be able to be done in the world. Look at the philosophical implications of, categorizing people in certain ways, of using certain types of tools. Look at the way that the notion of an objectivity gets constructed. Like the idea of objective truth is a constructed idea that comes about at a certain point in time, starting through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries over time, and is built in the way that we understand it today, crucially within those times. Like it has antecedents further back than that, but it is crucially built, reinforced, and maintained through those points in time as this notion of what we think of as science today comes to be. And so I say, look at all of these things and look at how all of these things have had a hand in building up really terrible programs, really horrible events over the distant and very recent history. Mm-hmm. And say, okay, you can see that this is done. You can see that human perspectives, human prejudices, human biases get built into these things that you want to think of as objective. And I'm not going to try to sell you a line that You can be perfectly objective, because that's primarily what I'm saying is impossible. And so I'm not going to try to sell you a line that we can somehow eliminate bias from science and technology, because that's just a different way of saying we could somehow be perfectly objective. It's not possible. We are perspective-having, bias-filled, pattern-matching creatures, humans and human societies. And so what we can do instead, rather than aiming for some kind of pure objectivity, is to try to get as many different perspectives as we can, and to try to understand in those perspectives how the biases of those perspectives have come to be, how the specific points of view were constructed based on the lived experiences of the people involved, of the political powers at play within those communities and those situations. There's a notion, situated knowledge comes out of feminist epistemology. This idea that we have, because of who we are, because of the life that we live, because of the communities in which we were raised, because of the kinds of worlds that we live in, a particular kind of knowledge on the world that is just as valid and just as valuable as the other kinds of knowledge held by the other kinds of people who have different lived experiences and knowledge in the world. It teaches you something different to ask, say, a black lesbian coder in Silicon Valley what it's like and what it means to code and what it means to build technology than it does to ask a white heterosexual man who still is of the overwhelming majority of lived experiences in that same space. And so, again, I don't want to say that you can have a bias-free technology, but you can be very intentional about what kinds of biases you allow into the system. You can be very intentional about saying whose lived experiences, whose perspectives, whose ways of understanding the world, whose knowledge gets brought in to build these systems. And if you're more intentional about that, if you are careful and open about that, I think that you can learn how to take those biases, and in sociology and religious studies we call this bracketing out bias. You take those biases, you put them off to the side, and you say, I know these are here, I know what they are, I know how they work. What is that going to make me more likely to do, and how is that going to make me more likely to behave? And then when you do that, you can kind of adjust. You mitigate for it. And you say, okay, if that's the way I'm going to be, then maybe I question it when I start to move down that path. I ask myself, is that likely? Is that real? Is that true? Or do I just want it to be that way? If it's more that I just want it to be that way, I take the time, I step back, I reinvestigate, and I say, what other ways could it be? What other things could I learn? What might someone else know different? Who can I ask to kind of check my assumptions and my biases? What can I compare this against? And then we build that in as part of the system of technology that we're looking at, whether it's an algorithm, whether it's a physical artifact, whether it's some combination of both. And we say, okay, the way that this will exist in the world is as a process of that, as a result of that process, and as an ongoing component of that ongoing process. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully over time, that will just become the norm, the habit, that kind of bias checking, that mitigation, that bracketing out and saying, is that the case, or do I want it to be that way? Is it my biases that are leading me down this perspective? And if so, is that a bad thing? whose biases might also be good to have in this scenario. Who hasn't been heard from, who hasn't been listened to, who hasn't been believed, who hasn't been heeded, whose beliefs and lived experience hasn't been made known and understood in a way that would actually make this at least different, if not better. Who can I learn from?
It's almost like making technology more introspective.
Yes, very much so. Like that kind of introspection, I know a lot of designers, I know a lot of, various technologists, coders, etc. They're not unintrospective. They're people who do think about, the work that they're doing. They think carefully about, how to get things done. But there are also people who don't think about the implications of the work that they're going to get done, or who don't think about the social factors that lead them to doing the work in the same way. Like, some people do both of those things, and some people don't. The people I've worked with, the people who code, who design, who implement these kinds of technologies, again, pretty careful. They're pretty, intentional about the work they do. But there are also those out there who aren't, who want the shortest, point between an idea that can be taken to market and the profits from that idea. Mm-hmm. And who want those profits to be as long-lasting as possible without recognizing that, if people don't want to use your product because it's racist or sexist or, ableist or homophobic or whatever, then it's not going to get you a lot of profits.
Yeah, and this reminds me of your blog, your website name, A Future We're Thinking About.
Yeah. I
love that.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that?
Well, for that specific reason, I was trying to think of, I'd started trying to figure out a way to put my work out there and a header under which to put my work out there. And I started this actually as Patreon first. And when you start a Patreon asks you, what are you creating? And so when it shows your page to people, the first thing that you'll see at the top of people's pages is so-and-so is creating X, Y, and Z. And I wanted to say, okay, so what am I creating? What am I trying to build? And it's like, is it writing? Yes, but writing about what? Writing about technology, writing about society? Okay, yes, but what? To what end? Is it just writing? It's not just writing. I'm also going to do, video blogs. I do audio, long form audio, like things like conversations like we're having, or just me doing audio versions of things that I've written, or recordings of presentations that I give. I also do video recordings of presentations that I give. So it's like, it's not any one of those things. So what are these things all about? What are they toward? And, what do I want to make? I want to talk about technology. I want to talk about science. I want to talk about magic. I want to talk about philosophy. I want to talk about society. I want to talk about people as individuals, but as groups, as communities. I want to create a future worth thinking about for all of those people. I want to make something that we all have together to look forward to work towards, to consider as a possibility, and to figure out what it would take to turn that into an actuality. So that was the best overarching header I could come up with for it.
Mm-hmm. And what came first, A Future Worth Thinking About or Technocult?
for me, a future worth thinking about. Technical was actually around a lot longer than me. Well, not than me, but than my stewardship of it. That was actually Technical was Clint Finley's baby originally, and Clint I've known since the days of old internet. We've known each other for a long time online, and the work that he was doing there has always been, bringing in ideas and notions about the overlaps of technology, the overlaps of the occult, comics, pop culture, the way that he thinks about and works with those things. He's been writing for Wired magazine for a long time, and he got to a point where he wanted to focus more on his public facing writing that he was doing, and he asked me in 2015, which was the first time that we met in person, even though we had known each other on the internet for a while. He asked me, if I would like to take over Technical for him. And, he said that the work that I've been doing and trying to weave together conversations and thoughts about technology and the occult has been, the kind of thing that he's been aiming towards, but that he wanted to kind of shift his output focus, and asked if I would be willing to take stewardship. And I thought about it for a couple of days. I was extremely honored for it, and I said yes. I've tried to maintain that viewpoint, but also I wanted to kind of shift it more towards original pieces of output as much as I could, bringing in threads of things that were happening in the world and putting them in conversation with earlier things that had been talked about, that I'd written about, that others had written about, and just trying to turn it more into a larger repository in that way. And that was just a shift that comes along with my kind of personality, I think. I don't do well just kind of plunking things in front of myself and saying, I will take this up whole cloth and just do what has been being done with it, even if what has been being done with it is really, really good. I almost always then start fiddling with it. I say, okay, what could I do differently that evokes more of my own perspective, that puts my own kind of way of living into it. So yeah, that's kind of what happened. And I've focused a bit more directly on the Technical newsletter than the website technical.net. But I still try to make sure that I put new and interesting content into the technical.net and use it as a home, a repository for longer form pieces that more directly bridge those elements as well.
And what do you think about the kind of recent rise in occult ideas in more mainstream culture, and that relation to technology and the internet? And
I think that it's definitely interesting. I'm not super surprised by it. Like I said earlier, it's kind of always been there as a kind of undercurrent. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it's more coming to the surface is not super surprising to me. The ways in which it has come to the surface has been somewhat surprising and in some cases disconcerting. There was, for a while, with the various white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups that were taking up what they were calling, meme magic, and making use of, what was kind of, late 80s, early 90s chaos magic principles and turning them into methodologies for distributing white supremacist concepts out into the wider populace. And that's disconcerting. Mm-hmm. Like that's really upsetting at a basic level. But in the same vein, a lot of the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and throughout the 90s chaos magic stuff never really got a full ethos, and never got taken up by people who said, and this is how it ought to be done, or this is what you should point it towards, and here's how to do it morally or ethically. And in fact, so much of it was about flouting kind of rote concept of morality that you just take up a whole cloth and say, and anyone saying to you, you must do things this way. And so I think that they're in much the same way that the kind of, early mid 90s internet was a lot about that. Those things grew up together. Mm-hmm. And so lacking that kind of, even the kind of really real self-moderation content that a lot of the early internet had, where people built communities, and even if they didn't have like laws and regulations coming from the state, they had group and community standards. Mm-hmm. A lot of the kind of rise in technologies that, or the occult technologies that we've seen kind of said, we're just going to do whatever with it. And that whatever has included a lot of not great stuff. But there are some things that are genuinely interesting to see, played out. It's difficult, but there's the, people who are looking at artificial intelligence as a way to build intentionally a new kind of religion, or to build a new kind of magic, to use algorithms as modes of divination, or to use them as modes of building servitor spirits in digital. There are some very cool and interesting things being done in that vein, like overlaps of even just like digital art and the kinds of things that can be done on a computer versus the kinds of things that can be done on pen and paper kind of medium, and the ways in which those can be translated out and dispersed out into the wider world. The opportunity for sigilization and the dissemination of sigils becomes wide, in a way that it just wasn't before. In much the same way as we were talking about earlier, there's this capability that is in the hands of pretty much everybody at this point. And those who have certain skills and perspectives and talents can put it to use in ways that were not as widely available to members of the populace in that kind of way before. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities, but there's also, as per usual, a lot of potential dangers within it.
Right, but I think like you're saying this way that, any individual can see how they can affect change in some way, or create something, or reach people, can give people a sense of autonomy and agency in the world that they didn't have before.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Like that notion of being able to actually to act and see your act spread out into the world. Even if you only got like 5 followers on Tumblr, but those 5 followers are all across the world. Mm-hmm. You write a thing, you say a thing into the microphone, you draw a thing, you whatever, and those 5 people like it or reblog it, that's people around the world that you never would have had access to otherwise. That's people that you don't have any other way of, you would never before, this past 20 some odd years, you really never had the capability of that easily affecting people that way. And that the possibility for a sense of agency, a sense of change in that, it's a big and very important possibility. And I find myself having to remind myself of that because we live in a world where those things have happened and they keep happening faster and faster, and the changes to them, the expectations from those changes keep happening faster and faster. And so I get to a point where I'm frustrated by people not responding to a piece of writing that I put out into the world in the way that I would like them to, or people not responding to, something that I've made or something that I've put out there as quickly as I might like them to, and it's like, I have an audience access to directly, just people who actually just follow me on the internet, of hundreds, if not thousands of people. We have the ability to, and those people are literally around the world. And they're people, they're friends that I literally could not have made if this framework didn't exist. And we can put ideas into each other's heads instantaneously around the world. And that's amazing. That's magical in a way that is just very often forgotten about. And I have to, like I said, I have to remind myself of that. I had to remind myself of something like that the other day. I was whining about how long it was going to take me to make a screenshot of something. It took me 45 seconds to make that screenshot and post it to the internet. And I was like, I should probably just shut up. That was not actually in any way onerous. It was just, I could envision a better way to do it. And then I started to get angry that that better way didn't exist. Which, again, that's not necessarily an invalid perspective to have. It's how we make changes to things. But at the same time, the way that exists took me less than a minute. So it's not like it's terrible. It's just that I could perceive that it could be better. And that perception overtook me so long that I lost sight of what I was actually capable of making happen. And how pretty amazing that capability was.
So what's next for you? What are you working on next?
Currently, I've got a couple of pieces of writing that I'm trying to get out there. I've got one that I'm presenting on cyborgs and disability, looking at the ways in which disability and mental health have always influenced the ways that we think about the concept structure of the cyborg, have always been at the heart of that concept structure, and what it does to try to reintroduce that in a very intentional way and to think about what that means. I've got a paper that I'm working on for a book chapter about the ways that our perspectives and lived experiences influence the algorithms that get made, and how those algorithms then go on to influence the rest of the world. I'm going to be trying to get a couple of abstracts together for a couple of conferences that are coming up. I'm trying to get my head together enough to put words down to really just frame these ideas. Similar to a lot of the things that we've been talking about today, been asked to do a couple of chapters for different things, talking about the overlap of technology, religion, and the occult, and one on the ways in which how we live in the world has changed, and what we can do about our intentional engagement of technology and different kinds of perspectives over the past 20 years or so. And other than that, I'm trying to enjoy the rest of my break before classes start again at the end of this month. To actually take some time to remember to relax and breathe. We'll see how well I manage to do that, but I'm going to try.
Yeah, enjoy it.
Thank you. I hope to. I've got some family stuff I'm looking forward to next week, and other than that, I'm just going to try to poke at these other projects a little bit here and there and get them done as they get done.
Well, great. Is there anything that didn't get brought up that you wanted to talk about or mention?
No, I think we touched on basically everything. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a conversation with Damien Patrick Williams. For more, please visit Damien's Patreon or afutureworththinkingabout.com or technocult.net and our publisher's website, trapart.net. Thanks.
Is often very quiet, muted colors. Apparently, the original human, or the original, and because century, and it has influence, was a being that was fruitful. You could always choose the path behind you, but then you'll never know your true potential. Yourself, the way. As you point forward and the fool loops his arm into yours and you begin walking, is this the message is lost? Where else, teacher pressed, half of a man, and he in and or accessible? Do we just for the and desire it ask him? We specifically concrete, the seekers. Another of that double nature, charged, bring out. We is one of I, we the serpent is, he replies. And on our way, I'm going to tell you about the so refined individual. Although the work, study, which two fundamentals, set of rules for both at the beginning and real of, you ended the chapter of the mile above land. Unconscious. Now you begin the lives. Us and you know they are both all and nothing contain. You took the heart from the obsession of a step, a courageous step close, a want to know the truth. Now you will know, but understand once it enters a culture's narrow definitions that are unifying, filled with sea, place, relationship, shifting of the mind. By the altered, it is in consciousness, the environment, in the tools, control, the use of, future, 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 future.